Welcome to Garden Plants with Jim Putnam. Let's talk Chirimen Chamaecyparis. This is Chirimen Chamaecyparis, or Chamaecyparis obtusa Chirimen. It is a selection that was introduced back in the 1990s. It was the 2011 conifer of the year. A really interesting upright grower with this kind of crinkly foliage along the stems. You can see how it's definitely has a super fastigiate habit, upright habit like this. Considered very, very slow growing, but we've put the thing in the ground in this space earlier this year, and it's actually grown about a foot this year. So I think probably slightly faster growing if it's in a location that it really likes. Has great dark, rich green color, a little bit of a bluish hue to it at times of the year, and the new growth is a slightly lighter green, like on a lot of conifers, and then it settles into this really interesting dark green color. Again, this one's actually grown quite a bit this season. We had it in a container for a little while. We like to buy these conifers when they're teeny tiny in little pots if we can find them, because we can get several different uses out of them over time. We could put it in a container, in a small container, and then let it grow for a couple seasons, and then we had it in one location in the ground, and then eventually moved it over to this spot where it is now. And you'll see these listed about 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide, something like this. I've seen the one over at Juniper Level Botanic Garden is over 6 feet tall already, and seen photos of them that tall or taller as well. So I don't think there's any kind of off switch to this thing. It's just kind of moderately slow growing probably for most folks, and you can keep it whatever height and width that you want it ultimately, but ultimately just has this upright habit. You decide how tall you want to keep it, somewhere between 4 feet and 10 feet, probably ultimately, something like that. For zones, zones 4 to 5 down to zone 8, we'll treat it a little bit differently here in zone 8 where I'm at in Raleigh in terms of sun or shade. So definitely in the colder zones, we'd have it in full sun all day long. For us here in zone 8, I've got it where the sun's coming up on it. It's got good morning sun, got midday sun. It really does need a lot of sunlight, but by the mid to late afternoon, the house is putting some shade across it and keeping the roots a little cooler on it later in the day, and that really seems to help it not kind of cook in our zone 8 area here in Raleigh, North Carolina. You see up close on this thing how interesting it is, how all this kind of spiky growth is so interesting. This one's never really been had any pruning done to it, but you can really do manipulative pruning to this thing. It can be bonsaied, it could be wired, the stems could be wired in different directions and shaped different ways. All kinds of interesting things you could do with this plant if you really wanted to, but it really is just kind of interesting on its own without any of that. So we're ultimately using it as a focal point behind some other lower growing evergreen shrubs and annuals and perennials, a lot of color. It'll give us 12 months interest as a backdrop, because it's really not going to change a whole lot over the course of 12 months. Can be used as, again, specimen, we're using it again as a specimen plant focal point. Great in a container. Yeah, I think you could use this as a low hedge next to a seating area, but it would take a long time for it to get any real height on it to create that. But what an interesting little border this would be to a little seating area where you could keep them maybe 4 feet tall. So you sit in a chair and you'd kind of be hidden behind these interesting things, and then you go stand up and look over the top of them. Drainage is kind of the key to happy Chamaecyparis obtusas in the garden, Chamaecyparis in the garden. We have this one, we have some pretty highly amended soil here where we've added wood chips initially, and those broke down. And so there's a compost layer here. So it's rich soil, but it drains well. And so it's not wet between rains and waterings. I will say though, that conifers aren't great at letting us know when they're dry. So if you do go through an abnormally dry time, this is a plant you're going to want to think about giving some additional water to, because it'll just thin. It won't do what leafy things do and just kind of wilt. It won't tell you. It'll just start dropping interior foliage, and then it'll take a long time for that to recover. Pruning wise, you're not going to have to do a whole lot of pruning on this. I could top it right now and make it slightly shorter, Or if it had a crazy limb coming off the side way over here and I wanted to get rid of it, I could just kind of do that any time of year. If you needed to do real general pruning on it, probably late winter, early spring would be the best time to do that. We fertilize this entire garden once a year with an organic fertilizer, and that's totally adequate for this plant. So sometime in February or March we'll do that. Doesn't really need a whole heck of a lot of extra fertilizer. Really very low maintenance plant. Deer resistant, rabbit resistant, doesn't really, not going to give you a hassle in any way, and it's going to add a tremendous amount of interest. Look how cool this thing looks here in our garden in Raleigh, and I expect it over the time that it goes from, it's 3 feet now, as it goes up to 5, 6, 7 feet, it's just going to become more interesting and more weird looking, and offer a tremendous amount in your garden or our garden here in Raleigh. So thanks for watching.